I'm becoming surer than ever that we may be making a very big mistake, destroying the jobs and businesses of hundreds of thousands of Australians, maybe soon millions, for too little gain. I am surer than ever that our politicians are tackling this crisis the wrong way. In fact, this afternoon it seemed the Prime Minister maybe got that too, announcing at last that all people now returning from overseas must go into 2 weeks of quarantine in hotels monitored by the Army and the police.
States and territories will be quarantining all arrivals through our airports in hotels and other accommodation facilities for the 2 weeks of their mandatory self-isolation before they are able to return to their home. If their home is in South Australia or in Perth or in Tasmania and they have arrived in Melbourne, they will be quarantining in Melbourne. If it's in Sydney, it will be in Sydney. If it's Brisbane, and so on.
Now, this is a very important step. 2/3 of people infected have brought this disease in from overseas. We've taken far too long to slam that gate. And the Army will also now check up on everyone already in self-isolation. And again, good, but late. But this is only the start of the very big shift that we now need to make, and urgently, because right now the government is burning down the country in order to save it. Yes, we must still have social distancing. Yes, we must wash or disinfect our hands. We must protect the sick and quarantine the infectious. But politicians, pushed by many journalists, have panicked. They've overreacted by also forcing shut so many businesses. They've killed so many jobs, and that has caused enormous suffering. So tonight, I'm going to show you 2 things our politicians must take into account before they leave this economy a smoking ruin. One is another country with a similar population that's fought this virus even more successfully and without shutting down businesses. And second, point to the encouraging evidence today that the rate of infection here is already slowing, and that the danger here and in Britain is not as great as predicted. Today is when you must start to question our governments. Are they now causing more harm than good? Okay, let's start with today's figures. Again, promising news. It's true that the number of cases in the 24 hours to 3 p.m. today went up around another 367 cases. But there's not a single extra death to the 13 that I told you about last night. Just 13 dead, 1-3. Now, a rise in infections is not good, but we are slowing that rate of rise dramatically. For 2 weeks, the rate of growth of infections was dangerously high, exponential. It was at 21% one day, 25%, 30% plus. The last 3 days, much lower. And today, the lowest growth rate, 13% more cases. 13 is still, of course, too high. But that is before the tough new close downs this week have had an effect. And that's one reason why we will not run out of intensive care beds in 10 days' time, as the Australian Medical Journal claimed today. But I want you to listen now to the scepticism on the ABC when Deputy Chief Medical Officer Paul Kelly tried to calm down that latest reckless scare. I'm going to play you a couple of minutes of this exchange because it perfectly demonstrates one of the big drivers of this very damaging panic. We have journalists, particularly on the ABC, our national broadcaster, who seem unwilling to believe good news.
We will definitely not be overburdening our intensive care units in 10 days. I disagree with that premise.
Well, hospitals are trying to double their ICU capacity right now to more than 4,000 beds. When will that be ready?
Oh, well, that's well in train.
Will that be ready for 10 days' time?
We won't need that extra capacity in 10 days' time. We've had very few people in intensive care up to now. Up until yesterday, there were only 20 that have been in ICU the entire time that we've been having cases since January. So we've got many more than 20 beds in our ICUs. Most hospitals in Australia have a surge plan every winter. We get a lot of flu cases, and that puts pressure on our hospitals every winter. So the hospitals are very prepared for this sort of thing.
We do, but we also
really
hear stories of ramping, ambulances ramping and people being kept in corridors. When are you confident that those 4,000 beds will be in place?
They'll be in place when the need is needed.
And that is?
And it went on and on in that vein. Meanwhile, in Britain, a huge winding back of the scare. Less than 2 weeks ago, Britain's Imperial College warned the government that if facing in an unmitigated coronavirus epidemic, it would predict 500,000 deaths in Great Britain. 500,000, and more than 2 million in the United States. But now the Imperial College says, well, actually, Britain's death toll could end up being substantially lower than 20,000, from 500,000 to 20,000. Lower than, with most of the fatalities in people who'd have died later this year anyway. That's what they said. They were already very sick or frail or very old. Put all that together, and here is what we're seeing. We're seeing possibly 1 million Australians thrown out of their jobs to fight a virus that's far less deadly than first thought and overwhelmingly kills the very old and frail. And it's a virus that most of our sick caught overseas or on a cruise. And doesn't that make the real solution here absolutely obvious? It is not to totally smash our economy. It is not to shut down thousands and thousands of workplaces. It certainly isn't to do what gung-ho premiers like Victoria's Dan Andrews wants, and what the Prime Minister hinted at today, a lockdown of all non-essential businesses.
I would caution against the way people talk about this word lockdown. And the reason I'd say it is this, and I know it's meant innocently, I don't want to give people, and none of the premiers do, that's going to be some place that we might get to where people can't go out and get essential supplies, that they can't get the things that they need to actually live life for the next 6 months.
Our new approach must instead be to quarantine all people coming in from overseas, as the government today said would now happen, finally. It must be to aggressively track down everyone who is or even might be infected and force them into isolation and check their whereabouts at least a couple of times a day. Did you know the Victorian Police have so far found 42 people who were meant to be in isolation? Well, they weren't where they were supposed to be, or they'd given a false address. That's got to change. And the government has also really stepped up protection for everyone over 65. It's got to create an army of Meals on Wheels people, so these vulnerable people, the ones doing the dying, don't need to leave their homes. Every one of our 13 dead has been over 68, every one of them, most much older, and many already with other serious health conditions like cancer. And finally, we must throw everything into finding a vaccine or treatment ASAP. But let all the other Australians get back to work, and soon, while there's still enough businesses and jobs left to save.